there's been no prospect for some time that this war would ever end without Ukraine giving up some territory. The question is what territory and on what terms, and what would be, crucially, the security guarantees for Ukraine to prevent Putin from continuing. And that, I think, is the gravest danger of all.
Sir Keir Starmer has welcomed President Volodymyr Zelensky to Downing Street this morning as Britain announces plans to scale back so-called reassurance forces in Ukraine, instead promising strong sanctions against Russia. The Times has been told that Russia and the United States have been discussing a model to end the war in Ukraine that mirrors Israel's occupation of the West Bank. Those plans will give Russia economic and military control over occupied regions of Ukraine under its own governing body, imitating Israel's de facto rule of Palestinian territory. This all comes ahead of President Donald Trump's anticipated meeting with President Putin in Alaska on Friday. Author, journalist and foreign affairs expert at RUSI, John Kampfner, joins me now to give us more insight. Welcome, John.
Good afternoon, Danny.
Britain has announced its plans to scale back reassurance forces. So how detrimental may this announcement be to Ukraine's war effort?
To be honest, everything, Danny, hinges on Trump and Putin. All the other announcements, initiatives, Zelensky's constant trips around Europe, they are as nothing compared to the vagaries of Donald Trump's mind and what Vladimir Putin may or may not persuade him to believe in Alaska tomorrow.
You're a sort of distinguished critic and describer of Labour's policies over a long period of time, so you'll be aware of the problems that there are with any sanctions regime. Now, President Donald Trump and Prime Minister Starmer have both mentioned stronger sanctions on Russia. How seriously should we take this? How much of a deterrent will it be for Russia in their offensive on Ukraine?
The sad truth is that sanctions have made only the slimmest dent on Russia. I know many Russians. I worked as a correspondent in Russia for many years. I once interviewed Putin for 3.5 hours as part of a small group, and I'm in touch with people there, although many Russians we know have long left the country because it was not safe to be independent reporters. They have changed the name of McDonald's. Russians have to fly via Dubai or Turkey to get to their holiday homes in the south of France, or to drop their children off at British private schools or whatever. But if you're in Moscow or St. Petersburg, far away from the front, and actually far away from small, miserable Russian provincial towns, which are the source of the meat grinder, are the source of the soldiers who basically go into Ukraine in order to die. If you're among the wealthy and the opinion formers in the big Russian cities, you are noticing almost nothing about the war and almost nothing about the sanctions.
So when we talk about this potential peace, all of it seems to be involve some sort of acceptance of Russian occupation of territory. And so the issue is only whether it's de facto, in other words, it's just recognising reality on the ground, but doesn't accept it in law, or actually de jure, in other words, you accept internationally, you accept Russian sovereignty in a formal sense. Are either of those plans actually acceptable, considering the position that we had at the beginning of the war, which was that Putin's aggression should not be rewarded? Both of them in some way do reward that aggression, don't they?
I mean, it's worth just going back to the beginning, and it really depends what your starting point for all of this was. A lot of people in Europe and in the United States didn't believe Putin would go in February 2022, even though the American intelligence was pretty clear of the buildup then. He marched in, and everybody imagined he would take Kyiv and install a puppet in rapid fire. That didn't happen largely because of Zelensky's extraordinary defiance rallying the country around. So from that point, Putin's invasion hasn't worked. His assumption, and I think the unspoken assumption of chancelleries and around the world, was that Putin would take Ukraine. Now, from the point that Ukraine has found itself since, and don't forget, it was first invaded in 2014, many of the areas we're talking about, Donbass and Luhansk, and of course the peninsula of Crimea, were taken by Russia illegally in 2014. There's also been an element of self-delusion among all of us. Our governments, that's the American government under Joe Biden, successive British governments, German, French, and others, gave Ukraine support, and they gave them weaponry to halt the Russian march, to stop them from making significant incursions. They have never given Ukraine the weaponry required to drive the Russians out. That's partly because they were scared about the possible response of a nuclear-powered country such as Moscow, and partly they didn't have the money, or they didn't want to spend the money. And many European countries and America, they wavered. They've always been also quite skeptical about Ukraine. So our role in all of this is not anything like as glorious as we would like to think it is, or as I would like to have hoped it would be, but we are where we are, and I don't think there's been no prospect for some time that this war would ever end without Ukraine giving up some territory. The question is what territory and on what terms, and what would be, crucially, the security guarantees for Ukraine to prevent Putin from continuing. And that, I think, is the gravest danger of all. Wherever we stop this, and it won't be de jure, it will be de facto, for Putin, that's just a breathing space. He'll wait, he'll retrench, he'll test Trump's mettle, he'll do all kinds of deals with Trump in the Arctic and everywhere else. You'll have Trump towers in Russian provincial towns. Don't forget, Trump wants to do a deal with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. He's a real estate man. Once he feels he has got Trump where he needs him, and he pretty much has done already, he will just go further into Ukraine, and he will possibly also go into test the West's resolve in Moldova and possibly even in Estonia.
Isn't Trump, as one final question, isn't Trump just reflecting the difference between US opinion and, I suppose, European, but also particularly Ukrainian opinion? So Ukrainian opinion is still pretty resolute, doesn't want to really sacrifice any territory. In the United States, there's never been the same visceral reaction to this war as there has been here, because it's just a lot further away and people are less engaged with it. And so I wonder whether Donald Trump isn't making a decision just on his own behalf, but also one that, with his kind of instinct for American voters, he appreciates the country wants.
I think that's a fair point that you make. But I would also say that the difference between the United States on the one side and Europe is not that great, and that opinion is divided or varied, not just in the US, but in Europe too. There is a strong sense of, oh, can't we all be done with this in many parts of Europe, and also in Ukraine itself. I mean, unlike Russia, where young men have been paid hugely. I mean, this is one of the untold stories, the bounties that impoverished young men in absolute horror stories of provincial towns have basically been, they and their families basically been offered money for their deaths to go into fight into Ukraine. But there seems to be a limitless supply of Russians prepared to take that risk. In Ukraine, there has been conscription, and it's a much smaller country. That country is exhausted. I don't think the issue is, might people want there to be a ceasefire? It's on whose terms. And the real fear that I think many people have, and that I have, and we will see it in the next 24, 36 hours, is the extent to which Donald Trump may be hoodwinked by the very smart and devious Vladimir Putin.
Well, John Kampfner, journalist, author, and senior associate fellow at RUSI, thank you very much indeed for joining me.